Welcome back to the Postscript. I'm here with Pastor Greg Axe of Crest Bible Church, and we're having a conversation about church history. And it's been a lively conversation so far. We've talked about a lot of different things. Today we're going to have a conversation that's specifically about the 3rd and the 4th century of church history and how the Catholic Church came to be, the influence of the Roman Empire in that, and really just how things unfolded and some of the really corrupt doctrines that came out of that time period. Greg and I have been talking about that, and I want to ask him some more. So, concerning those early heresies that crept from the 2nd century into the 3rd century, the influence of the Gnostics, stuff that we've talked about in previous episodes, tell us about some of those heresies that were prevalent and really impactful early on.
Some of the things that crept in the church early on were things like maybe infant baptism, for example, where the understanding that man is born with a sin nature, but if we could do some sort of religious ceremony for our babies and undo that sin nature, then we can plug them into the church and sort of, make them Christian or Catholic, of course. Ultimately, we can make them Christian against their will by baptizing them when they're, it's a counterfeit twist off of the circumcision in the Old Testament at 8 days, which was a sign for the nation of Israel.
Right.
And so now we have this infant baptism thing where I'm a Christian because I got baptized when I was a baby.
Right.
Well, how much of it do you remember? And what faith did you exercise in doing so? You just laid there and cried.
Sure.
That was one of the heresies that got in. Another one was the doctrine of purgatory, where...
And did that precede, where did that doctrine come from? I mean,
it became formalized as a Catholic doctrine under Pope Gregory around 600, but it was taught much earlier than that. And Augustine taught it in the 400s, and even before that, it was around at that point in time. Again, extra biblical. You can't find any verse of Scripture that really supports it unless you really squint real hard. In those verses they claim supports it, but it doesn't. And this is just the opportunity for somebody to have a second chance, if you want to call it that.
Sure. It's a doctrine of convenience.
Doctrine of convenience, and it's been abused by the Catholic Church for centuries to extort money from people. Dad dies, and we go to the widow, and we say, okay, well, I'll help pray your husband out of purgatory if you give me enough money. And Jesus talked about it, devouring widows' houses in Matthew chapter 23. That's where a lot of that comes in from. So that idea of that I can pay for my own sins, whether it be
sacraments,
whether it be indulgences, whether it be after I die, I can go to a short-term hell, if you want to call it that, for a period of time. And once that period of time is over with, then all my sins are purged, and I can pay for them myself and go to heaven.
Sure.
All that denies the payment of Jesus Christ on the cross of Calvary.
Of course, yeah.
And so that's where a lot of those kind of things come in.
So you're saying even before we have the establishment of the formalized Catholic Church, the the empirical sponsorship of a church, we're beginning to see issues with people's soteriology, issues of even just cosmology, right? So you've got this idea of purgatory. This thing doesn't actually exist anywhere in Scripture, but we've invented it as a way of squelching people's fears about hell.
Right.
And so these doctrines, indulgences, people paying their way to gain favor among church elders, these corruptions were already beginning to take place.
Yeah, they were inbred from early on through Gnostic theology, through the editing of the Bible, through people just reading stuff into Scripture that wasn't there, and coming up with these things just to satisfy their own rejection of God, if you want, a rejection of the doctrine of grace and salvation.
Okay, and so with that, those heresies floating about, and we've talked about this void in previous episodes, this void in leadership, and then people beginning to take authority in the major cities, places like Rome, Constantinople, Antioch, Alexandria, these kind of warring factions of leadership and authority over the church. These things are beginning to take place, and then suddenly there is a man that kind of rises in leadership in Rome, Constantine. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us about Constantine and his life, maybe his story a little bit?
Okay. We talked in an earlier episode about the persecutions against the early church and how God was moving to get this infant church going. The persecutions actually ended up working against Rome because people would see these people giving their lives for their faith, and it would be drawn to that, and it would spread through the empire like wildfire. Right. So here comes all these emperors for a couple of hundred years trying to squelch and stamp out Christianity by force and persecution, and it just makes it grow even more and more.
Yeah.
Constantine, and to summarize it, launched a military campaign. He was born in England, and launched a military campaign coming through Europe to conquer Europe because he wanted to be emperor of the world.
Right.
And that's the goal of all these pagan, bloodthirsty,
right,
disgusting, filthy dictators.
Right.
Okay, is to dominate and control the world.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to take over the world. The whole world will be mine.
Right.
And so he's marching through Europe, killing people to consolidate his military gains. And this Christianity is bubbling up through the empire like this, and he looks at that and makes a shrewd political calculation. Whereas he is opposed to Christianity to begin with, he says, I've got this block of people here that nobody's been able to do anything with, and every time they try to do something with them, it just gets stronger and stronger. I will woo them into my camp and use them as my base to gain mm-hmm. political power and mm-hmm. control. So he feigns Christianity, if you want to call it that. And of course, the famous Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD, where he's north of Rome, and one of his rivals is in Rome, and he's about ready to conduct battle with him at that time, and he has this vision in the middle of the night.
Now, from what I know, he actually prays to the sun god.
Yes.
He's calling upon a pagan god.
Yeah, he's pagan before, during, and after.
Right. He's not praying to Christ.
Yes.
He's praying to a pagan god, and then he gets this vision that you're about to explain.
Yes, and he gets this vision of a Christ that appears to him with a cross in the sky and a wording underneath it that says, "In this sign conquer," mm-hmm. roughly speaking. And then he takes that sign of the cross, paints it on his own equipment, has all of his soldiers paint it.
Their shields
and their helmets and everything, paint the cross on there, go into battle the next day, and they win that battle. Well, he credits that victory in battle to the God of Christianity. He adds that God to his list of gods. There was never any conversion of
right.
Constantine
I want to ask you about that
to
too.
faith
right.
in Jesus Christ. Never. Okay? It was a political, military convenience where a very shrewd politician ropes this group of Christians in by claiming to be one himself right. when there was never any conversion whatsoever. And
something really interesting about that too is that during that time period, that most of the pagans, most of the idolaters mm-hmm. were nominal in their faith.
Yeah.
And so it didn't make any difference to them what the state religion was, because they were going to be nominal no matter what, right? And you've got these people who are incredibly passionate, the Christians, and so what he did is just essentially merge the two together
yes.
by controlling the religious leadership.
Yes. Now, you put it in this context. You're part of a group of people that have been persecuted for 200 years. And unmercifully persecuted. You've been hunted down and killed in big groups of people. You've been fed to lions.
Right.
You've been the subject of worldwide scorn for 200 years. And somebody comes along and says, you know what, I'm on your side now. And this guy is conquering the world.
Yeah.
I'm one of you. You can be, and everybody's going to go,
right.
And that door was opened, and he seized that opportunity to do so. Everybody comes along and talks about that. All the church historians will write about that vision that Constantine had, and they'll say Christ appeared to him, and they'll tag Jesus at the beginning of it. Mm-hmm. Now, here's where knowing the Bible might help you a little bit. There's two Christs in the Bible.
Sure.
There's Jesus Christ and there's Antichrist. Now, I don't know about your Christ, but mine would not appear to a filthy, disgusting, pagan, vicious murderer and encourage him to continue murdering people to take over the world.
Sure.
Okay? Now, that's just a basic
doesn't really fall
into
Christian doctrine.
Right. Okay? However, all these historians are going, oh, well, that's the movement of God. Mm-hmm. Wrong God.
Right. Right.
Okay?
And then beyond that, so what he does is he takes his power and his financial backing, and he says, hey, you don't need to meet in homes anymore, in these small, decrepit places. Let me build you a basilica here and there, and starts funding the work. And so suddenly the bishops that were maybe a little bit hard to do, in terms of finances, suddenly they were wealthy, and they had the backing of the emperor.
Yes.
And so then it's easy for them to be swayed. Right? They've been bought off.
And you've lived under that oppression for 200 years, and somebody lifts that off of you, you're like, oh, wow, this is awesome. Okay? And I understand that. But you've also got the creeping in of these bad doctrines and the void of authority and all those things that have led this group off to a little bit, and then Constantine ropes them in.
Yeah. And then so there's a bunch of characters, just to paint the picture. You've got warring factions in terms of doctrine, different camps, really all over the known world at this point. I mean, in Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and of course Rome, which becomes the seat of religious power. Like there's already this void in terms, like who really is going to have this last say in doctrine?
Right.
Well, obviously, if Constantine has anything to say about it, it's going to be the seat will be Rome.
Yes.
So you've got all these different camps, and you've got all these different heresies that are being debated over, and you've got all these different characters, and so suddenly you have Constantine who's going to mend the fence, if you will, and so he steps in, and one of the biggest issues of the time was Arius, a previous writer, theologian, if you will, who's writing about something called Arianism, and Constantine thinks he's going to put this issue to rest. Can you tell us about Arianism a little bit and what was going on? Okay,
the seed behind that, of course, again, was the Gnostic thought. We can't we can't accept by faith the fact that God was manifest in the flesh in Jesus Christ. So we have to be able to demonstrate this and prove this. This is the skepticism of man. Some things, Brandon, in life just have to be accepted by faith. And we talked about this a minute ago. How do you know for a fact that the Great Wall of China exists? Have you ever seen it?
I've never been.
Never been. So you don't know for sure.
No.
Firsthand.
Have some evidence, but I've never seen it.
You accept that by faith because of others' testimonies and pictures that you've seen.
Yeah.
But hey, Photoshop is a powerful thing.
It's true.
So there's this element of theology and religion that and thought that mankind has that just cannot accept something by faith that they can't explain. And how do you explain that God could be a man? I don't know. I know that it's true because my Bible tells me that it's true. And I have evidence of it because the one who claimed that he was died and came out of a tomb by himself.
Sure.
Now you give that a shot.
Right.
Okay? And until somebody else does that, I'm going to hang with him.
Sure.
Nobody else will. So we have that proof that way, but that's not enough for some people. So they want to try to create an explanation for how this man, Jesus Christ, could be so unique and so earth-changing and history-changing and so different. Well, he must have been just an apparition, Gnostic thought. He was not really a man, he just appeared. Some of the other things where he was God from his baptism to the cross.
Right, the Spirit of Christ came on him.
The Spirit of God came on him at his baptism. He wasn't God before then. but he was at the baptism, then he remained to be God in the flesh, and when he said, my God, why hast thou forsaken me, that's the God left him at that point in time.
Right.
So
and he became Jesus again.
It was just Jesus again, okay? So we have to explain all this stuff this way. And it gets into this nuance of stuff, because I can't accept it by faith, I have to explain it. And Arius was one of those guys like that, along with a whole bunch of other people. And his basic position was that Jesus Christ was a lesser God. He wasn't God the Father manifest in the flesh. He was a created being by the Father, and he was a God, but not the God.
Right.
Okay. Well, that obviously is heresy. And there comes the Orthodox side of believers at that time refuting that. That was just one of the main factions you talked about. All of these various different thoughts or ideas were ripping the fabric of the empire apart because you have factions that are arguing with each other.
Right.
Constantine called the Council of Nicaea to try to mediate that argument, and that was the main argument. Is Jesus Christ God or is he not?
And so he calls, how many pastors?
300 and some bishops together.
Yeah. Most of which were in opposition to Arianism.
Yes.
They found out pretty quickly that, well, most of us are on the same team.
Right.
But the interesting thing is that he comes and presides over the council, which is an assertion of his authority and his stamp of approval. Explain why that's so significant, and this idea of the marrying of government and spirituality and faith,
right.
And why that became such a dangerous thing and how that snowballs.
Well, one of the principles in my book at the beginning of it says this, that Satan controls people through a triangle of religion, politics, and the military. So once a thought process permeates an entire group of people and they all think the same, then that thought process gets legislated. Then the government enforces that legislation, if need be, with guns and bombs and whatever. Okay? And that's a pattern that has operated throughout history forever. Has nothing to do with names, dates, figures, and facts, and when somebody was born and how do you spell his name. It has to do with Bible principle that permeates those things. So now you have a thought process. We're all Christians now because Constantine says we're all Christians. So we're going to pass laws that says you must be this. Now we're going to enforce them at the point of the sword or barrel of a gun. And so that happened during that particular time. And in order to weed out the false teachings and the false doctrines, they have this Council of Nicaea to get everybody together to try to agree.
Big surprise, there were more issues after that.
They come up with the Nicene Creed, which people have died arguing over for centuries. Did not do all it did was muddy the water.
And so you've got still the warring factions. You've got Constantine overseeing all of it. It's a big mess. He probably was in over his head in many regards. Didn't know what he was getting into.
Right.
But what he does is he combines governance, and he combines that with a faith system.
Yes.
And we over time have seen that through the Roman Catholic Church, this marrying of government and religious faith systems.
Yes.
And we see that even today. Just to fast forward, how is that moment in time, that rulership of Constantine, affected Christianity and specifically Catholicism over the last 1800 years?
Since that point in time, yeah. He sits over the council as the Bishop of Bishops.
Did Eusebius give him that title, or was
he
that
claimed
he just
it himself? And when he had never studied theology at all, never read a Bible, he becomes the Bishop of Bishops because he has the guns. He has the power. So he's going to settle the argument over this thing and reign over this deal. Now you've got the political leader governing the church, and there's that marriage of church and state. And when that marriage of church and state happens, it's just a matter of time before the bullets fly and the bombs go off.
Sure.
because you have to enforce that. Now we see that played out for centuries through history.
The birth of Christendom as a concept.
Yeah, and the concept of a church-state government out of Rome and other places, but specifically for this discussion from Rome, that dominates the world for 1,000 years. Mm-hmm. You look at it in our world today, Islam, okay? There's a religious thought process that permeates that entire group of people in a certain area and region. Then that gets passed off as what we would call Sharia law, or what variations thereof, but now it becomes against the law to do anything that is against that particular faith. Mm-hmm. And now we're going to enforce that by jail sentences or executions. And
we're going to further that perspective by warring against those who don't believe the way that we believe, and will force our hand, our religious hand upon them, which is exactly what happened and invited what we refer to as the Dark Ages.
Yes.
I mean, it invited that perspective, invited that in.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened under Constantine. He politically seized that opportunity of that church that could not be squelched by persecution, and roped them in on his side, wooed them in the marriage of church and state.
And diluted the whole thing.
And messed up the whole thing with his false perspective.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Postscript. Keep an eye out. Next week there'll be another episode, another interview. You don't want to miss out. Again, we want to thank everybody who's helped out with this episode. We want to thank Pastor Greg Axe. Have a great day.